Mullberry here, and welcome to not World of Tanks per se, but something that's quite related to World of Tanks. Today I'm going to be talking about skill metrics, and the main way I'm going to breach this topic is I'm going to be reading this article by Rocket Brain Surgeon on worldoftankslabs.net. This is a fantastic website, and it allows you to do such things as check your actual WN8, check how you're doing, check what your rating is, and it also has some amazing articles by people like Rocket Brain Surgeon, who's a very skilled player, and has things like tips, video strategy, all the fun stuff that you could ever need to learn to get better at World of Tanks. However, due to the fact I'm talking about skill metrics, I'm just going to let the article do the entire presentation. All credit given to Rocket Brain Surgeon. This is a beautiful article, and everything he says here is still accurate to this day. So without further ado, here we go. WN8, the good, the bad, and the padding, by Rocket Brain Surgeon. Obviously no one agrees on the best way to rank people or activities, but WN8, things you need to know about it. Deal more damage and pick the right tanks, or at least that's generally how it works. What is WN8? WN8 is the latest rating system trying to measure that ethereal factor, skill. It's a complex formula that measures performance on a tank-to-tank basis against the general population, so people aren't punished for playing tanks that might not be the best. WN8 does a lot of things right. One of the goals of WN8, why it was established as the currently best skill evaluating metric, was to reduce the phenomenon of stat padding. Stat padding is where a player does an unnatural activity for the express purpose of inflating some metric. Win rate is just too easy to farm to be considered a skill metric on its own. Tank companies or low tier play can yield absurdly high win rates, up into the 80 to 90% plus range. So there was a need for a metric that tried to measure skill more accurately for normal play. The original skill rating, efficiency, weighted damage, kills, tank spotted, and calf points all roughly equally. The problem was that light tanks could hide for the entire match and then accumulate meaningless cap or defense points when the game was either irrevocably won or lost. Sitting in the cap circle in a blowout win was also incredibly more valuable than chasing down the remaining enemy. So instead of being around the average of 1 cap point per game, it was 5+ cap points per game for these players who made it a complete mockery of the efficiency metric. While it was later reworked to reduce the effect cap points had on rating, no one in NA really takes it seriously anymore. WN7, a precursor to WN8, made the combinations of wins, kills, and damage per tier as the core of the metric. Getting rid of meaningless cap points went a long way towards measuring actual skill and reducing padding, but it didn't solve everything. Kills were weighed heavily in the metric because the thinking probably went, how the heck does one stat pad kills without being good? Well, I mean, everybody finds a way. The problem was that the rating was account wide. So playing low tier tanks where kills are plentiful for a good player, with some higher tier tanks will create weirdly high WN7 values. The other major problem was that artillery, scouts, and poor tanks were heavily penalized so they couldn't get the win rate high enough, example like artillery, or get enough kills, for example for scouts, or couldn't complete with the 1 or 2 best tanks in tier when this article was written, the Hellcat and the KB1S. WN8 was produced to measure in a more apples-to-apples kind of way. Account-wide measurement will always have problems as there are too many variables to skew the equation. WN8 takes the data-mined values for each tank and compares your stats in each tank to the general population. So if you like playing bad tanks, that's okay. Your performance in that bad tank will be compared to others driving that same tank. For 99% of the population, WN8 does an excellent job. For that top 1%, however, it gets a little bit weird. Disclaimer. I really appreciate the work that went into WN8. I know that the limitations of WN8 are mostly because Wargaming won't release more metrics, such as spotting damage, for retrieval with their API. I don't have all the answers and know that criticism without solutions is just pointless complaining, and I'll try to put out some ideas on how to improve it at the end. However, how does WN8 work? Every tank has quote-unquote expected values of kills, damage, spots, win rate, and defense points. These values come from the creators of WN8 looking at VBAddict.net, a huge database where people upload their dossier files and it spits out a lot of fun information. The creators chose these values for each tank as averages that we should expect from them. If you do better than other people at killing, dealing damage, firing tanks, winning games, and defending the cap, your rating is higher. Straightforward so far. I'll present you the scary looking math, but don't worry, I'll explain what it means in a very simple way and why it matters. Here's the formula. Now for everybody watching this, please look at the screen currently. I'm not going to read that out. Anyway, see the numbers? Those are weighted constants. They prioritize certain metrics over other. Damage gets the largest number because that is what the creators want to matter the most. Let's look at my T62A numbers as an example to see how WN8 works firsthand. The T62A expected values for WN8 per game are 0.98 kills, 1682 damage, 1.61 spots, 0.74 defense points, and a 50.4% win rate. And that equals a 1580 WN8 rating. However, his averages are 1.51 kills, 2400 damage, 2.13 spots, 1.2 defense points, 59.4% win rate. Equals a 2856 WN8 rating. Let's play with my T62A numbers and see what happens. I won't go into the math of why it works out this way, but I'll show you some scenarios that make for an interesting picture. My T62A WN8, 2856. So, what does my WN8 do if I win 70% of my games instead of 59.4? Well, WN8 goes up 27. That's right, winning doesn't more influence WN8 at all. A huge jump in win rate has almost no effect. What does WN8 do if I win 50% of my games instead of 59.4%? It goes down 99. So it's possible to have great WN8 but have zero impact on your win rate. Skill metric, right? I've seen people with purple WN8 who can't break 50% win rate. What does my WN8 do if I spot 4 targets instead of 2.13? It goes up 32. Spotting targets is capped, and I agree with this. People could otherwise just YOLO into the enemy team and collect a scout medal along with a high rating. This doesn't work. If the spotting value gets too high, it just uses damage stat instead. That doesn't make any sense on the surface, but it's to prevent abuse. Just know that spotting doesn't really matter as long as your damage rating is high. What does my WN8 do if my damage drops to average? It goes down 1086. There we go. WN8 is severely weighted towards dealing more damage. What does my WN8 do if my damage increases by 1 shot per game to 2700? Well, my WN8 goes up 328. Again, we see how much stronger increasing or decreasing damage is for any other metric for WN8. So what does my WN8 do if my kills expected, goes down to the expected 0.98? Oh, we lose 404 WN8. So kills are important too, but if you're increasing your damage, then the kills should rise naturally, so it shouldn't matter. What does my WN8 do if my defense points drop to 0? Nothing. As the spotting, if the defense points get too high, it just uses the damage stat instead. This is to prevent abuse. So a quick summary. I've shown how WN8 is all about damage. For the vast majority of people and tanks, it works very well. Increasing your spotting targets doesn't substantially increase your rating. Increasing your defense points doesn't substantially increase your rating. And increasing your win percentage doesn't substantially increase your rating. But I haven't talked about the expected values yet. Remember those things that this whole calculation is based on? Expected values and their problems. The expected values for every tank can be found at WNefficiency.net, link also in the description. Expected values are pretty good in theory. Bad tanks should have worse stats per game than good tanks. That's why bad is bad and good is good. Easy. The creators choose expected values for each tank, what this tank should be able to do, and how it has historically performed. Reaching the expected values gives a rating of 1580 WN8, which is green, or good. The metric was made for EP measurement, so it's going to be more concerned about the upper end of the scale. If you don't hit the expected values, don't worry about it. What if a tank is OP? Then it gets a high expected value because people are dominating in it. It can even be a select few players that raise the bar considerably for everyone else. What if a tank was OP but got nerfed? The M4 Sherman during the heat spamming period was better than most tier 6 tanks, and the expected values show it. The M4 Sherman expected values per game, 1.73 kills, 801 damage, 1.57 spots, 131 defense points, a 60% win rate. So to get a rating of 1580s, those are the numbers you have to hit. Oh, and the M4 Sherman isn't even close to the game breaker it was before the nerf. Seriously, there's no way that someone reaches 3,000 performance nowadays, whereas people are hitting 4 to 5k WN8 in other tanks. Quick break from the article. The M4 Sherman's expected values, I am almost completely sure, have been changed recently. The expected is much closer to the 4 to 600 range now. But I think old stats in the tank were negated, so that's why they fixed that. What if the majority of people suck in a tank, bringing down in its historical performance? Then this tank gets a low expected value, meaning it's easier to pad WN8 for the same amount of effort. Don't worry, we're getting there. Typically, mediums and heavies are harder to play than SPGs and TDs, so the expected value is lower. Lights are by far the hardest class of tank for the average person to play, giving them a crazy low expected value. What if the majority of people are great in a tank, bringing up its historical performance? Then the tank gets a high expected value, making it harder to achieve good WN8. SPGs and TDs will have high expected values. They are relatively easy to play in comparison to mediums, heavies, and lights. So, here we come to it. The best WN8 tanks per tier. Here are the tanks that have low expected values for what they do, in no particular order. The goal is to get 3k WN8, Super Unicum status. But even if you reach that, these tanks should naturally raise your WN8, as they're capable tanks but have low expected values. Some of these tanks will be more difficult than others, but that's the point, being the average rather than getting the highest damage possible. Light tanks will be streaky, while the mediums will be more consistent. Tiers 1 to 4. No. Tier 5. The ELC, the Chaffee, the T34, and the Panzer 3/4. The trick is to increase the damage dealt. For the ELC, getting a 3k rating takes 1.2 kills and 800 damage. Sounds like a lot until you realize that's only 3 shots of damage per game. Super Unicum status for the ELC is landing 3 PNY shots per game. That has changed, not so recently. The medium tanks aren't the best in tier by a long shot, but racking up 800 damage per game should be doable with both, and to score a Super Unicum rating. Still true. Tier 6. All the light tanks you can handle, the E8 and the T34-85. Tier 7. All the light tanks again, though the WN131 especially. Same with the T71, the KB13, and the T43. Here we start to see a trend. The Russian mediums are great for WN8 padding. Racking up 1500 damage per game will do the trick. I'd actually advise not to pad with Tier 7 tanks, though, as they have difficulty competing with even Tier 8 premiums. Tier 8. Light tanks? Ha! All the light tanks. T44 and the Pershing. Another Russian medium? No way. Aim for 2k damage per game. The T44 and the Pershing are certainly capable of that. Tier 9. The E50 is criminally good for padding at this tier. Much wow. Patton, other mediums besides the T54E1 are fine as well. 2300 damage per game will be the mark, and the E50 getting buffed after these values were made should make it very easily. The most ridiculous thing to me is the T54 isn't even penalized despite being the best tank in tier and at one time glaringly OP. Tier 10. The Russian mediums and the IS-7. Seriously, what? What do 3 of the best tanks of the tier get the best WN8 padding numbers? 2600 damage per game is all it takes for the RU mediums to hit 3k WN8. This is where the real padding is being done, where people are hitting their 4 to 5k WN8. The tanks of this tier are cranking out far better numbers than their expected values. The IS-7 has a lower ceiling than the mediums, so going to 4 to 5k rating mark is best done with the mediums. So, if we're going to talk about gameplay, here we go. The gameplay style for the maximum stat padding. Here it is. Don't take the risks. A big damage loss is greater than a low damage win in the eyes of WN8, which is a big pet peeve of mine. Scout tanks are ranked on being damage dealers, which is obviously silly. However, you do need to be in an area that is able to consistently see and shoot the enemy. When I say don't take risks, that means let someone else scout for you. I don't see platooning as detrimental to stats, which goes against popular opinion. A good WN8 game at tier 10 only needs 4 to 5k damage, so there will be 20k plus to go around. There will always be a few campers, potatoes, AFKers that will accumulate next to 0 damage anyway. The next tier of players will deal minor damage, so most of the 20k damage can and probably will be dealt by your platoon anyway. In fact, I see platooning as a good thing for stats, as it means the games will last longer. Longer games, more damage. If you're afraid you won't get damaged when platooned, go to the opposite side of the map so you're not competing. To get deep Super Unicum stats in the 4k plus range, it takes a lot of shots flying, like running low on ammunition every game firing. I will admit, there's more skill in this than I originally thought, but I'm still not sold on this idea that more damage is automatically better. So, putting my money where my mouth is. If WN8 has padding problems, why don't I pad? Fine, I will. I normally bounce around 2700 to 2900 WN8 while playing a variety of tier 7 to 10 tanks, mostly Chinese, French, and Russian in that order, with a few US and no British or whatever that is, German. Here's about 75 games in my padding experiment. So, I've been able to bump my WN8 by 1k just by being more choosy about my tank selection, 80%, and my playstyle, 20%. I don't play the T37 with the 50B nearly as much as I used to, as they have very high expected values, 2157 and 1915 respectively. That would mean just to get a 3k rating it would take almost 4k average damage per game, which is unlikely for me. The more I play, the more Russian mediums I'm playing, as they are sturdy platforms with relatively little chance to face plant. Eliminating those sub 1k damage games is crucial to hitting 4k WN8. I've tried mixing in IS-7 games, but that tank is a lower ceiling than the RU mediums. It just can't put out that much damage, even on its best games, whereas the RU mediums have enormous games on any point in any map. The same problem is happening with the Chinese tanks. They have a lower ceiling than the RU tanks due to their terrible accuracy. I've tried mixing in light tank games, and that works, but light tank games can be vulnerable to getting one shot and severely submerging their rating. Light tanks are still good for padding WN8, but I'm going for 4k plus, and getting a 0 damage game is crushing. So the tanks I'm playing, T62A, Object 140, T54, Type 59, and FCM. I get 3k WN8 anyway in the Type and FCM, and with some playstyle adjustments they've been boosted even farther. My room rate trended downward as I was doing more sniping than useful activities, so I platooned today to bring that back up. For my playstyle changes, it's been about keeping the gun active over all other considerations. I don't care if the opposite flank is failing or it's safer to stay hidden for a bit. I need to keep shooting as much as possible or I miss out on damage. Recognize the blowout victory early and sprint forward for damage. Recognize the blowout lost early and farm your teammates while they die. Spotting damage is purely incidental. 175 games in. My drop in the survival rate tells the story. I was so concerned about getting max damages that I was at the front of the pack and pushing it a bit too much. Note the increasing in detected tanks as well. Being less aggressive would probably bring my WN8 to where it was around the 75 game sample, 3.8k. I actually platooned more than normal during this experiment and my average kept climbing. The only time when damage is a problem when platooning is if your blue-purple platoon gets another blue-purple platoon on the same team. At this point damage becomes pretty rare and it's a sprint to the enemy as they evaporate. The end result was that I was able to pad my WN8 by 600 points, most by choosing different tanks. So I went from strong unicum performance to solid super unicum performance. Thoughts on the experiment. The Object 140 is a WN8 dream tank. The extra gun depression lets the tank spam shots anywhere on the map. The T62A is more limited shot, as shots were delayed due to gun depression. Penetration matters more than I thought. Not only does it let more shots go through, as it severely loses aim time, but if you can just auto-aim and click the enemy, there you go. The choices of the Type 59 and the Type 62 were suboptimal. I should have played more FCM and AMX 1390. I rarely shoot premium either tank, hurting my damage against more armored lineups. I have more respect for WN8 after doing the experiment than when I started. I think I could break 4k WN8 by playing more Object 140 and FCM rather than T62A and Type 59. The rating does have its flaws and is somewhat gameable, but at the end of the day, the player has to deal more damage than others. That's not automatic or guaranteed. So when it comes down to it, here are my ideas for improving WN8. I think the overall metric is good. How much damage the player deals in Tank X versus other players in that tank, it's something not easily captured by other metrics and offers a solid at-glance picture when viewed alongside win rate. I'm not saying the ideas below are the end-all be-all, but I want to offer suggestions to move that rating forward and improve upon an already good metric. 1. 2 sets of expected values, historical WN8 versus recent WN8. This takes care of the OP or underpowered phenomenon. The recent WN8 is a full list, while the historical version is just where some tanks need patching. Get rid of the spotting / defense / win factors of the equation since they don't really matter anyway. Just make it a pure comparative damage stat instead of including the noise. We already looked at the combination win rate and WN8 for skill, so let's further that route. Massage the expected values at least a bit. I know most of these are based on historical data, but there's no reason why the Object 430 is the same value as the Object 140. The 121 has a higher target than the RU's mediums and the E50M despite being significantly worse. Start with historical data and then adjust them by 5%. Summary. Again, for 99% of the population, WN8 does an excellent job. Things like medium and light tanks should have lower expected values because they're generally more difficult to play. WN8 is a significant step over WN7 and the other metrics we have previously had, but it is not perfect. WN8 rewards perverted gameplay at the top. Scouts judged in damage potential, big damage losses over average damage wins. Tank choices purely to game the rating. I was able to achieve a 600 point swing based on tank choice. Since this is trial, I stats have started their migration back towards where I started as I've been mixing in harder to score tanks. Overall, I think the metric is a net positive by far, and the creators will curb some of the issues in the future. And that is the end of the article. WN8, the good, the bad, and the padding by RBS, also known as Rocket Brain Surgeon. It's still accurate. That's how metrics work. And I hope all of you have enjoyed this video and the gameplay that went along with it. I apologize for having to show you stuff, but I can't imagine trying to explain that formula midway through. So besides that, I hope you guys have a fantastic day. Like the video if you liked it. Dislike it if you disliked it. You know how this all works. Subscribe if you want to see more. I have some upcoming videos that I think, if you're learning World of Tanks, will be extremely useful for you. But besides that, have a fantastic day, and I will see you out on the battlefield.